So good morning, everyone. I'm Jean-Pierre Cabestan, a professor at the Department of Government and International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. And our department is delighted to organize this online seminar. And the first online seminar after the Chinese New Year. So 恭喜发财, 恭喜发财 to everyone. And we're delighted today to welcome Dexter Roberts as a speaker. Tiff, as I call him, he's been an old friend. We met in the late 90s, early 2000, when he was working for Business Week and then Bloomberg in Beijing. Tiff spent more than 2 decades in mainland China, and he was the China bureau chief for Asia and news editor of Bloomberg Business Week, reporting from all over China, the provinces and the regions, as well also on Taiwan, Mongolia, and North Korea. Now, he moved back to the US 3 years ago in 2018. And since then, he's been an adjunct professor of political science at the University of Montana. And he's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Asia Security Initiative. And he launched not long ago a newsletter called Trade War, which is, I think, a very timely and appropriate title for describing the state of the relationship between the United States and China, even as we enter in the Biden administration. Today is going to talk about his latest book titled The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. It is the subtitle is The Worker, the Factory, and the Future of the World. And it sort of encapsulates very well what Dexter Roberts has researcher on to prepare this book, which is on the migrant workers, people moving from the countryside for poor areas of China, like Guizhou, to places, booming places, the factory of the world, as we say, places like Dongguan, Shenzhen, and other places in southern China or eastern China around Shanghai. So the book is also very timely because, as you know, President Xi Jinping announced not long ago that China has succeeded in eradicating extreme poverty. But at the same time, not long before, the Prime Minister Li Keqiang indicated that there were still more than 600 million people in China earning less than 1,000 yuan a month, which means less than 140 US dollars a month. So you still have a lot of poor people in China. And I think that's part of maybe China's miracle, economic miracle, but also one of the downsides of Chinese economic development and ambition to become the largest economy of the world and maybe the most powerful country of the planet at the same time. So without further ado, we'd like to first of all welcome Tiff and give him the floor. He will speak for around, I think, 40 minutes. He has prepared a PowerPoint, and then we have another 40 minutes for Q&A, and I hope you will ask questions. We have a very nice turnout today, so I'm happy to welcome again Dexter Roberts and invite him to share the screen with his presentation. Thank you and welcome. We can't applaud you, but we can still raise hands if we want to express our appreciation and gratitude for coming today. And speak to us in Hong Kong and around the world. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Professor Cabestan. I should say that not only are we old friends going back many, many years, but in my many years in China as a reporter, whenever I needed to do a story on Chinese elite politics or leadership politics, the first person I would call is Professor Cabestan. So he's a friend and a very informed and important source of knowledge on Chinese politics. I have to say that's because that's the truth. So thank you for the kind introduction. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay. It actually tells me that I cannot share until the other participants stop sharing. So here we go. Okay. There we go. Oh, there we go. I think I've got it there. So I want to talk today about, I'm going to talk about how policies today in China are holding back the lives of a significant portion of China's population, and indeed are an obstacle to its continued economic development. And I'm going to do that by talking about my book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, The Work of the Factory and the Future of the World, which came out last March, March 2020. I'd like to also just mention that I'm going to have a Chinese edition will be launched very shortly in April. I think it'll come out. It's being published by a Taiwanese publisher, so it will also be in complex characters. So good for Hong Kong. The title may be slightly different, but it will be my book. So that look forward to that if you are interested in today's lecture and you want to read it, and you're interested in reading it in Chinese rather than English, or in both languages. We'll soon have a Chinese edition. So in order to talk about these policies in China today, again, I want to talk about my book. To do so, really talk about the origins of my book, and to do so, I really need to go back to the year 2000. So quite a few years ago. I, at that point, had been based in Beijing, China for 5 years. I came there in 1995, and I'd been writing a lot about things going on in the big cities at that point, writing working for Business Week magazine. So doing a lot of business stories, writing a lot about companies, writing about wealthy Chinese in the cities, writing about the returnees, Chinese that had been educated overseas, that were coming back to China just then as economic opportunity took off to start their companies, entrepreneurs and others. So that's what I've been writing a lot about those first 5 years. In the year 2000, I, for the first time, went down to the then relatively remote and quite poor, and still unfortunately today not very wealthy, province of Guizhou in the southwest of China. And I went actually twice in that year in 2000. And I was working on 2 cover stories for Business Week magazine at the time, which is what took me there. The first story you can see pictured right here was called China's Wealth Gap. And it was about exactly that, China's wealth gap. This is back long enough, 2000, that we have of course had several generations of General Secretary earlier running China. At that point, it was General Secretary Jiang Zemin. And during that year, or perhaps the year before, he launched a policy called Develop the West. And the Develop the West policy was a recognition of this growing wealth gap that was between city people and people in the countryside, but also very much a regional gap between the coasts and the interior provinces. And at that point, again, we're quite a few years into reform and opening. If you will recall, Deng Xiaoping said something like, let some people get rich first, sort of launched China on a trickle down, as we called it in the West, policy path. And what we'd seen is some people were getting rich first, those along the coasts, and the interiors, however, people from the interior, it was not happening nearly so fast. So Jiang Zemin launches this policy in order to address this growing wealth gap. I went to that year to Guizhou, as I said, for the first time. It was in the early spring for this cover that came out in May. And then later that same year, I was back again for another cover story. And as you can see it here, that was called The Great Migration. And what was it about? Again, a very obvious cover title. It was about the migrants of China. Already at that point, some couple hundred, several hundred million strong. And of course, these are the young people that even still today leave their homes, often in agricultural villages in China in the interior, and have gone to the coasts usually to find jobs. Back then, almost exclusively in manufacturing jobs in factories, but also on construction sites. That's shifted today with many more going into the service sector. This second cover, The Great Migration, I visited for the very first time a little village in the southeastern part of Guizhou. Guizhou's in the southwest. This is actually in the southeastern part of the province, very close to the border with Guangxi. So quite a beautiful, beautiful part of China with some of the karst, stunning green mountain landscapes that Guilin and Guangxi is famous for, but also extends into Guizhou, particularly this part. And so that was the second story. And I was looking at this related flood of hundreds of millions already, young people who, because of the wealth disparity, were leaving their homes, leaving agriculture, and looking for work on the coasts. So that same year in 2000, what I did for the Great Migration, the second cover, is I did the trip to this village, which is called Binghua, or Binghua Cun, Binghua Village. You can see a picture of it here on the right. And this is a more recent picture, actually. And this village became a place that I came back to repeatedly over the next 20 years. And that first visit, I was there to see some of these young migrants, where they came from. I also had gone slightly earlier that year to Dongguan, the sort of the ultimate factory to the world, made in China, miracle city in China. As I'm sure most of you know, or all of you know, a city that has been dominated by literally thousands of export-oriented factories. So what I did was I went and met some workers at their jobs in the factories, and then a couple months later went back to see them, see some of them back in their hometown of Binghua. So I should say that when in the process of doing these two cover stories and focusing in on the wealth gap and on the migrant workers of China, and this was the first time I really covered their experiences and these phenomena in such great depth, first of all, it had a very strong personal impact on me. I felt like the stories were important, they needed to be told, and at the same time, I felt like they were key to China's economic future. Both the wealth gap, the fact that China was not developing particularly equally or evenly, and the fact that there were these hundreds of millions of already of migrant workers traveling throughout the country, already making up a significant portion of the entire workforce of China, still today making up the majority of the workforce of China. This realization I had that this phenomena and these people were key to China's economic future. I also had an editor at the time, a wise editor, who said to me, these are very interesting cover stories you've done, Tiff. Someday you might want to think about trying to write a book about these people and these places. And I put that idea in the back of my mind and then started to pursue it in later years. That same visit, I was the first time I met this extended family, many of them distantly related, all with the surname Mo. This is one of the Mo's that I met, Mo Rubo. They all hailed from Binghua village, and like many villages in China, they were distantly related, most people in the village, and they shared the same surname. They happened to be a group of people that are from an ethnic minority, a small one called the Buizu, the Bui ethnic minority. And from this very, as I said, this beautiful part of Guizhou, a beautiful part of China, but very poor. So almost everyone in that village was going out to find work. Mo Rubo, I actually that year only met in Dongguan at his factory job, where, as you can see, he was a welder. I think he was about 21 years old then. He had already left Binghua for probably 5 or 6 years at that point. He left when he was 16 or 15 or 16, dropped out of high school, or dropped out before high school, I think, and had bounced around the country as a migrant would. Had worked in Ningbo near Shanghai, had worked in Shanghai, and then had done a whole bunch of different factory jobs in different cities around Guangdong. Ultimately, when I met him, working as a welder in a Taiwanese-owned factory in Dongguan. So just a few pictures here. I'd like to just highlight the fact that these photos are from a wonderful photographer named Greg Girard. You can see him credited under where it says Morubo and his girlfriend. He's a Vancouver, British Columbia-based photographer who actually was based in Shanghai and in Hong Kong for many, many years, for decades, longer than I was in China. And he was with me on these early reporting trips and many other reporting trips. And at that point, he was taking pictures for Business Week. He very kindly allowed me to use a series of his photos from then in my book. And they're in a black and white form in the book. And I think they make the book even stronger. So a shout out to Greg Girard here. He's also done amazing pictures of Hong Kong. He's got a book on the walled city of Hong Kong and a bunch of other interesting photo books. Very talented. So this is a picture here again of Mo Rubo, the welder from Binghua. He here is on the streets of Dongguan, the year 2000, with his girlfriend at the time, also a migrant worker, but actually from Henan, so another relatively agricultural, poor part of China, but much farther north, of course. And this is just a candid picture of them on the street. The young woman here in the red vest is named Mo Meiquan. She's also featured in my book. I also met her in Dongguan the same time I met Mo Rubo. I think they are distant cousins. And I was very fortunate that when I went back after visiting and meeting her in Dongguan, then I later went a couple months later to Binghua, and she actually was back in her village. She was back for two reasons. One was to help her parents with the rice harvest. But the far more important reason was her identity card had expired. And this is, again, the year 2000. Back then, it was very, very risky for a migrant worker to be on the streets of a city with an expired identity card. As a matter of fact, there was this terrible practice that was called at the time these black jails that were set up in the cities, and migrants that were picked up with expired identity cards or with not their proper papers could be thrown into these quote unquote black jails. They were called custody and repatriation centers. And I mention this because it just highlights how vulnerable and precarious the existence was for migrant workers back then, some 2 decades ago. So she had gone back to make sure that she'd get a new renewed identity card before she went back to Dongguan. One of their cousins had actually been picked up earlier, another person by the surname Mo, with an expired identity card, but it had been thrown in a black jail, had basically been held there for ransom by the police, who would then, they would use these black jails basically as a way to extract money from the migrants. They find an excuse to pick them up on the streets and put them in there, and then they'd have to pay some sort of exorbitant fine, often several months of wages for their work. And so the Mo's had sort of scrambled and got money together and bailed out this cousin of theirs. And so Mo Meiquan had decided that she was not going to suffer the same fate. So she was back in the village. Again, this was the year 2000. One of the things that perhaps surprisingly I kept hearing in this visit to the village was about China's imminent entry to the World Trade Organization. If you will recall, this is 2000. China was to enter the World Trade Organization at the end of 2001. At that point, the people of China, certainly the officials of China, but even in far off villages, many people were aware about China's imminent entry into the World Trade Organization. There had been in 1999 heated negotiations, particularly between the United States and China, to sign one of these, a bilateral accession agreement. And once the US and China signed the agreement, which basically was a series of commitments by China to open up its economy, open up its closed industries, and vice versa to a degree by the US. At that point, they knew that China was on course to join the WTO. So that year, I met with the village chief, and he spent a lot of time talking to me about how he hoped that China's eventual entry into the WTO would actually bring investment into this little far off, still very, very poor village. And what his hope at the time was that they would actually get money invested in a fruit or vegetable processing factory. And this therefore would allow the young people to perhaps not have to become migrants. They might actually be able to earn more money in the village rather than just work in subsistence agriculture, which was really the only option at that point other than leaving and becoming a migrant worker. So his hope was that they would get this factory. So as I said, late 2001, China enters the World Trade Organization after 2 years of successful negotiations with the US. This is featured in my book as well. This was a big part of what I covered in the latter part of the 90s when I first moved to China, was the process of China preparing to enter the World Trade Organization. The impact on the country was enormous, as everyone knows now, with these different market opening agreements. We saw and investment access agreements signed by China. We saw an explosion of money and investment coming into China, and indeed many, many Hong Kong investors and Taiwanese investors who had already come to China after WTO entry came in far, far larger numbers. We saw foreign investment into China jump from $47 billion in 2001, the year that China entered the WTO, to $124 billion a decade later. And we saw living standards go up, and not just in the cities, but in the interior, in the poorer parts of China as well. So I want to jump forward many, many years now. First of all, I should mention that as part of Jiang Zemin's Develop the West program that was launched earlier, I mentioned you in 1999 or 2000, a big part of that was building out infrastructure throughout China. And that's where we saw what eventually became, for example, the high-speed rail networks throughout China and the expressways, which cover so much of China today. This continued certainly with China's entry into the World Trade Organization. And this is a picture actually not far from the village of Binghua, although this expressway does not go, there is not a good road from this expressway to Binghua, but nevertheless, this is a road near there. And it's just an example of this tremendously successful infrastructure development that China accomplished over all the years since Develop the West, since it entered the World Trade Organization. If you look carefully at this picture, I don't think it's large enough to actually read, at least not for me, but you can see the large billboard by the road, and the fact that it's gold and red, of course, is a hint to us about what it is. It's a big propaganda poster. I think it might have been a Xi Jinping slogan. So of course, what we saw, along with infrastructure pushing through into the country, including into the poor West, we've seen a massive push of ideology throughout the country as well. So jump forward until today, we've seen this undeniably impressive progress in China's economy. It went from being, somewhere near the bottom 10 of the world's largest GDP by economies by GDP to today where it's number 2. And many people are predicting that it's going to, of course, exceed the United States in a number of years to become the world's largest economy. We saw this made in China miracle where China is now one of the biggest manufacturers in the world, of course, and one of the very biggest trading, export and import countries in the world, along with the United States. We also saw, as I said a moment ago, we did see living standards go up a lot. This year, 2021, is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And as some of you probably know, China has set some centennial or 100-year goals that they intend to see accomplished by this year. And one, Professor Cabestan already mentioned, eliminating or ending absolute or extreme poverty. And as anyone who pays even halfway pays attention to Chinese media will know, they have just successfully done that because they are talking a lot about it, and Xi Jinping's talking a lot about it. It's one of his signature efforts to transform China, ending extreme poverty. And indeed, they have done it. It's a tremendously impressive goal. Also, one of their centennial goals is to create what they have referred to as a moderately prosperous society, or in Chinese, in Mandarin, 小康社会. And that involved, they had targets. They wanted to, I believe, double the size of the entire GDP between 2010 and 2020. And I think it was double per capita income as well. And it looks like they are on track to succeed, they've certainly doubled the size of the economy. It looks like they're on track to also double the per capita GDP incomes as well. So again, economic success has been, is undeniable, very impressive. At the same time, I'd like to highlight another statistic, which I think is revealing about where China is today and shows that not everything is so positive. Back in 2000, when I first started spending time in the interior of China and in Guizhou, one of the statistics that you often would hear when speaking to officials, and I heard this repeatedly when I was talking to officials both in Beijing but also in Guizhou for this wealth gap cover story I did, was that the gap on average between incomes in urban China and in rural China was about 3 to 1. So your average person from the city was earning about 3 times as much as your person from the countryside. And this was something that I was told again and again was unacceptable, and that they needed to narrow this gap. Well, the fact is that gap is almost unchanged. It may be something like 2.8 to 1, but the gap between the countryside, people from the countryside and people from the city is roughly what it was back in 2000. Even as we have seen people overall become wealthier throughout China, we've also seen a rapidly growing income and wealth gap. And depending on who you speak to, it's anywhere from one of the worst in the world to, potentially socially destabilizing and extremely worrying. Thomas Piketty, the noted income inequality expert, has done research and looked at both the wealth gap numbers in China in recent years, but also looked at the speed at which it has been growing. And what he found, along with a fellow scholar, Gabriel Zuckman from the University of California, Berkeley, is that gap, that first of all, the gap is roughly similar to Russia, which, surprises some people. We think of Russia as sort of having this kleptocratic, era where distinguished by huge inequality. Well, China is has roughly similar levels of inequality, and probably even more worrisome, it is growing at a pace comparable to what we've seen in Russia, which is very, very fast. It's more, China is one of the most unequal nations or countries in the world today. So one of the questions that I try to spend a lot of time on in my book, and hopefully come up with some good answers to, is why this still is true today. The leadership has made it very clear, going back decades, that they think that the wealth gap and the income gap the gap as well, the regional gap between the countryside and the cities is unacceptable, and also is a problem for their future economic development. And there has been numerous large policy efforts to try to address these problems. And yet today we still see income inequality, wealth inequality, and as I just said, actually far more severe wealth inequality than was true back in the year 2000. So I argue in my book, and I'm going to argue here today, that I think that inequality has very much to do with a couple of legacy policies, and I call them legacy policies because they date back to the Mao era, that are still very much alive and well in China today. And number one amongst them is the household registration policy, or the hukou policy. Started, by the way, back in the mid-50s, although China had a household registration system before, the form it took back then, very much based on what was already what already existed in the then Soviet Union. Stalin had a similar internal passport policy that he called, I believe, Propiska, which was what Mao looked to when he created this household registration policy. So back then in the 50s, the household registration policy very much was about limiting migration. It ensured that rural people would stay in the countryside, that they would then, where they then lived and worked in communes, as Mao started to, after land reform, started to create larger and larger communes, and that they were restricted from traveling to the cities. And this really had to do with Mao's idea that in order to have a rapid industrialization, which was what he was aiming for, they really needed to have affordable and reliable sources of food and grains from the countryside. And the way to ensure that was to ensure that the people, the rural people stayed there, and that they were producing that affordable and reliable food and grain. So this was the household registration policy in the 50s, up until with small exceptions, as was true during the Great Leap Forward and the famines that followed that, and when rural people started to migrate simply because they didn't have enough to eat. Other than that, it was quite successful in actually keeping people from moving around inside the country. So fast forward to 1978, 1979, with Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening, he obviously, the restrictions on people moving around in migration and migrant workers are seen as a key part of the new economic miracle, a source of cheap labor for the factories and on the construction sites as China starts to modernize and open up to the world. And so the household registration is loosened significantly, the household registration policy, to where it is today, where there is pretty much free migration around the country. But what has not changed about the household registration policy, and this gets to the continuing inequality in China today, is the fact that today the household registration still ensures that the welfare benefits, both the health care that a person is entitled to, and the education that they can provide for their children, is very much tied to where they, or rather where their parents were born. And that means, in effect, that even as Chinese migrants, now 300 million strong, go and leave their villages and journey to the cities, in most cases, they are not able to get access to the same quality of healthcare that urbanites get, nor are they able to, in most cases, put their children into the far better financed urban schools of China. It also has given rise to a phenomena that I'm sure many of you are aware of, which is the left behind child phenomena. And that is when migrant parents end up leaving their children in the countryside because, for this very reason, because of the household registration policy, they are not able to, in most cases, put their kids into urban schools. And the kids end up seeing their parents once a year during the Lunar New Year, and are either raised by their grandparents, who are often illiterate today still in China, or increasingly grow up in these very large impersonal boarding schools, which I write about in the book, and I spent some time going through. And depending on what researcher you speak to, there may be up to 100 million of these left behind children who, because of the separation from their parents, because of the experiences in the boarding schools, tend to be, first of all, academically disadvantaged, drop out of school at much higher rates than kids from urban schools, and actually often have physical problems. They're often slightly malnourished. They're on average of shorter height and lighter weight than kids from the cities, and in some cases have psychological problems as well because of this phenomena of being left behind children. The other policy I talk about in my book is the dual land policy. And this, again, is a legacy policy dating back to the Mao era. And in effect, what the dual land policy means today is that whereas we've seen an explosion of wealth in China's cities, mainly sourced from urbanites buying and selling or renting out their apartments, we haven't seen a comparable phenomena in rural China. And that's because, again, this is a Mao legacy left over from the Mao era. Rural land in China is classified as, quote unquote, belonging to the collective. And what that in effect means is that the rural people, both the farmers and the migrant workers who typically will have a plot of land back in the countryside, really can't monetize the land effectively. They can't buy it and sell it. They can't make the same kinds of profits off it that you see people in the cities benefit from. And this, probably more than anything else, is behind the rapidly growing wealth gap, this dual land system. I should note that rural land is bought and sold. It's just not by the migrants and the farmers. What happens is often local officials in the villages of the townships are the ones that are making quite a bit of money from buying and selling the land. What they do in effect is they have the power to reclassify the land from agricultural use to industrial use or commercial use. And typically they would pay the farmers or the migrants a very small nominal fee for the land, buying this cheap agricultural land, convert it into a new use, and then sell it on to real estate developers and make a lot of money. And this has become a very important part of actually local government finances. Perhaps up to 50% of local government revenues are sourced either directly or indirectly from land revenues. This, however, is not benefiting the local people very much at all. So this here is actually one of my last visits to Dongguan. This is Mo Rubo again. He, unlike many of the migrant workers, is trying to make the best of it and settle down. And he has stayed in Dongguan all these years since I met him as a welder when he was 21. The woman he's with here is his wife, who happens to be the young woman we saw in the earlier picture, who was his then girlfriend from Henan. So they got married. And the other person, of course, you can guess is their daughter. I believe she was about 5, I think she was 5 years old in this picture, which is about a little over 3 years ago. During that visit, Mo Rubo and his wife, by the way, first of all, had started a small athletic apparel company. They aren't producing the products themselves, but they're sourcing it themselves. They have a brand that none of you would have ever heard of, which is a very small brand I had never heard of. And so they source from different factories and then go for the brand that they own the rights to, and then try to sell their products online. They had a small office out of the small apartment that they were renting, which was not far from actually the electronics factory that I first met Mo Rubo in, and not making a lot of money, but adamant about not wanting to move back to the countryside. Again, during that visit, their daughter was 5 years old, and the big question they were struggling with was her education, because she was at an age or a year away from entering first grade. And the options they had then were to send her back to the countryside, where she could, because of their hukou, she could go to school in the township near Binghua, where Mo Rubo had been born. But he was adamant, and his wife was adamant as well, that they didn't want to make their daughter into a left behind child. So they were looking for options for education in the city of Dongguan. Because of the household registration policy, she's not eligible for the public schools, which meant that the only option were one of these numerous private schools that have cropped up to cater to migrant workers who do want their children to be with them. These migrant worker private schools or private schools that cater to the migrant workers, unfortunately, are often of not very good quality, and even worse, they are actually quite expensive, far more expensive than, as you would imagine, than putting your kid into a public school where you don't have to pay tuition. So this was an issue they were struggling with, what they would do with their daughter and where she would go to school. So I finished before we get to the questions by just mentioning quickly that so my book came out, as I said, in March of 2020. So if you think back to then, China already had been dealing with the pandemic at that point. I happened to be in New York City for a book launch, a series of events for the launch of my book right then during March. My book came out on March 10th. I had to cut short my plans to do book events because New York City was just waking up to the fact that they had a COVID-19 crisis happening there as well. So as you can imagine, nowhere in my book is the pandemic mentioned. However, I'd just like to quickly say that I do think what we've seen in China during this last year, as it has dealt with the pandemic, actually makes some of the themes in my book even more crucial and important. And China, even before the pandemic, has been aware for a while that in order to continue to have a strong economic development, they need to move away from their old factory to the world model, which has served them so well ever since Deng Xiaoping set it off in the early 80s, but does not serve them very well anymore. And there are different reasons for that. The most obvious one is rising labor wages. We've seen manufacturing increasingly priced out of China to a point today where places like Mexico and Malaysia are actually far cheaper when you look at average manufacturing wages than what is available in China today. At the same time, China has been, of course, involved in a trade war with the United States, with the United States slapping, particularly during the Trump administration, repeatedly new tariffs on China. This also has made it clear that the old manufacturing to the world model is not going to work so well going forward. And finally, the pandemic. We saw a precipitous drop in global trade last year, and China responded by saying, okay, we've known that we have to make a transition away from this made factory for the world, made in China model to a much more an economy that's much more dependent on the spending power of its own people. We've known that for a while. Let's speed it up, because for all these reasons I just mentioned. So they've got new policies they're talking about. Xi Jinping has been talking about the dual circulation policy, which is a policy that is a dual, which is a nod to the fact that they will continue to trade with the world, but is much more emphasizing a focus on trying to boost the spending power of their own people. So this is something they know that they need to do. And the reality is, because of these legacy policies, which are contributing to the growing wealth gap, it has become very, very difficult for China to boost the spending power of those people, the other half of China, for a better word, for lack of a better expression, those farmers and migrants from the interior of China, which, by the way, together make up about half of China's population. So we're seeing them on the losing end of economic growth. We're not seeing their spending power grow in the same way we've seen it grow on the coasts. And we're not seeing them join the middle class the way we saw so many people in the cities of China join the middle class in recent years. So that is a dilemma for China today. I will stop here. I think I will stop here, and we can move on to questions, which will probably be a far more interesting part of today's lecture.
Well, thanks a lot, Tiff, for this wonderful presentation. Very much a boot on the ground analysis of the unprecedented transformation of the Chinese society, which have always been a rural society all the way to the early 2000s, actually. And that's a big question mark, when you have over 60% of the population are living in cities. That raised a lot of questions regarding not only everyday's life, standard of living, but also, I guess, government and politics. There are a lot of questions, I think, in the chat box. I think we can maybe first. Can you, Tiff? Can you read the questions in the chat box, or would you like me to read them for you? Or
if it's convenient for you, would you please read them?
Okay.
I'm not sure which ones we want to do.
Yes. Well, I will take them one by one. The first question from Morton Holbrook. It's about the WTO, and please discuss how state capitalism, whatever its right name, relates to the WTO and WTO rules against subsidies. What is China? Maybe it's a bit outside of the theme of your book, but you mentioned China's accession to the WTO as being a big boost of Chinese economic development. So maybe you can briefly address this question before we move to other questions, which are maybe more related to income gaps and to issues the wealth gap you've mentioned, and also something you haven't mentioned yet, which is the aging of the population. The kind of time bomb, demographic time bomb China is facing. To what extent does it feed the wealth gap? Because that's clearly the major theme of your presentation. And you have a two-tier citizenship now in China, which is one of the challenges. Maybe can you first maybe briefly address the first question regarding WTO?
Yeah. So I would say, first of all, sort of the story of the WTO has been, I would say, for many, certainly for many companies who had expected more rapid market access, there has been a level of disappointment. And I would say as well that when I first arrived in China working for Business Week in the mid-90s, from the very beginning, of course, I was writing about companies and foreign companies, and particularly American companies that were trying to develop their business there. And what I immediately heard about were these core issues that companies were confronting, which they saw, and I think rightly so, as creating an unlevel playing field for them as they started to invest in China. And what I would hear about was intellectual property theft. You would hear about forced or coercive tech transfer requirements as the price of setting up shop or doing business in China. Requirements that you joint venture, typically, certainly the auto industry is a classic example where foreign auto companies were restricted to the minority share, even if it was 49% of a joint venture, and they had to joint venture. and subsidies, direct and hidden subsidies. And the interesting thing that I've noticed over the last 2 years during the trade war are those are the same exact issues that companies and governments are bringing up today. And that is a reflection on the fact that those issues haven't gone away. On the subsidy question, I think there's been a push to try to broaden the area of concern beyond just direct subsidies, which China has a long history of doing, providing direct subsidies to industries and companies that they favor, but also look at subsidies like low cost or free land, power subsidy, subsidies to factories so that they pay very little for energy and so on. And so those have become issues. I think they, in terms of the World Trade Organization, we've seen under the Trump administration, in effect, a gutting of the organization. The Trump administration blocked blocked the appointing of new people in some of the arbitration councils. So the WTO is not functioning really properly right now. So that's a big issue as well as the disputes between the countries actually getting the WTO to a point where it will where it will function again and do good arbitration and mediation and in some cases levy penalties on industries in countries around the world is we're still a ways away from that. Of course, we're about to have a new WTO head, and I think progress will probably be made now that we have a new administration in the U.S. So I'll just say that about the first question. Demography is obviously extremely important to China's future. It's something I talk about at quite great length in my book. I mentioned earlier that China's manufacturing sector is increasingly pricing itself out of competition with countries around Asia and around the world, and that has a whole lot to do, of course, with demography. To some extent, the result of the one-child policy and other restrictions on births. We've seen a rapidly aging population in China, and the challenge China faces is one that the World Bank and other development organizations have referred to as getting old before they get rich. So other countries have gone through rapidly aging populations, like countries like Japan, but they did it when the average income per person was far higher than it is in China today. So we're seeing China's population age very rapidly. That has implications for the manufacturing sector, without question. China's responding to a degree by pushing automation in the factories. They still want to have a vibrant manufacturing sector, even as they rely less and less on migrant workers in their factories. So it has an impact there. It also has a big impact, frankly, on China's goals of becoming an innovative nation or innovative country around the world. There's been interesting research that shows that an aging population typically is not very innovative. So an older and older workforce, those aren't the people that are going to come up with the fresh, new, innovative ideas. So there's sort of an open question about the degree to which a rapidly aging population can be innovative. And then another huge issue, of course, is the financial costs of a rapidly aging population. And as has been remarked upon by so many before, China increasingly is facing a situation where fewer and fewer workers are supporting more and more retirees. And that's a burden on individual families. It's a constraint on consumption and expenditures for the families, which is an economic challenge for the whole country, as the government wants to push it towards a more domestic consumption-driven economy. And it's also a huge burden on local governments, who in China are in charge of paying social welfare costs. And the costs of paying the pensions or the new healthcare costs of an aging population is one that is already becoming challenging for China and will become even far more challenging going forward. So I think demography is a very substantial challenge for China no matter how you look at it going forward.
Can I chip in here and ask you a question related to this demographic evolution of China? Have you asked by any chance your migrant family and Mo Rubo about his plan for retirement? How is he going to finance his retirement? Is he going to save money? And what about other migrant workers? Because they're not entitled to any kind of pension for most of them. So they will have to save money or rely on their children or the child to survive after retirement.
Yeah, this is a huge issue. I mean, so China has made progress in trying to extend its pension programs throughout the country. But the big obstacle with migrant workers is the so-called portability of the pensions. And so the fact that if you're a migrant and you're moving from employer to employer, how do you ensure that if you are contributing anything to a pension fund, that that pension fund goes with you? If you are going to eventually move back to far away to an interior province, how will you ensure that you have access to that pension fund when you go back? The other, just as big, if not even more serious problem is that so many of them are not contributing any money and their employers are not contributing any money to pension funds. According to the Chinese law, the Chinese labor law, both the employer and the worker, including migrant workers, should be contributing to the pension fund and other social welfare funds. But what happens in so many cases in China is, and there's been interesting surveys done on this, actually by another Hong Kong scholar, Albert Park at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, looking at the degree to which employers and employees are actually amongst migrants are paying into pension funds, and doesn't happen in most cases. Often, I should say, the migrants themselves will agree with the factory managers or now it might be a restaurant they're working for, and agree that neither of them will pitch in for the pension. The migrants, as I just said, are uncertain that they will actually ever see this money, so why have it taken out of their salary right now? And of course, the factory owner or the manager of the restaurant has no desire to chip in on a pension fund if they get away without doing it. The other big factor is the sort of informal nature of work today in China, increasingly true in the service economy, where migrants and others aren't necessarily, they're often hired through middlemen or middleman companies. And those companies will do short-term contracts with the workers, and in some cases, they're not obligated to pay into the social welfare funds. So in many, for example, the motorcycle courier delivery business, which has become so important to migrant workers and so important for urbanites who rely on it in China today, most of those workers don't have contracts where they're getting paid social welfare benefits. Usually they're not working for the company whose outfit they're wearing. You know, whatever food delivery company it may be that is famous and, you know, is one of these much heralded tech companies, they don't actually have a contract with the person delivering their food or their goods in most cases. There's a middle company that is responsible for hiring these workers.
Tiff, we have a lot of questions. I'm going to move to the next set of questions. It's related to migrant workers who want to keep their village registry. You know, they want to keep their countryside hukou because they feel there are more benefit. Maybe they want to keep a right on the land use. You know, they want to keep their land use right. So can you tell us more about those migrant workers who prefer to, you know, or who maybe eventually return to their village or prefer to keep their village hukou?
So I think it's very understandable that they would not want to give up particular land use rights. But I do think it's a reflection of the fact that it is so difficult for them to actually be welcomed and be integrated into the cities. So in most cases, I would think, and this is what I've heard from many migrants, they don't actually believe that the cities and the urban governments are going to welcome them in and let their children into the schools and start to treat them as sort of full urban citizens. And with that knowledge in their head, you know, they often think, why would I possibly want to give up this one right I have to the land? The other trend that you've seen in China today with some of the household registration reform is to do sort of the equivalent of like a green card of household registration, where they basically don't offer them the same benefits that they would offer an urbanite with an urban household registration, but they give them some right to stay longer in the city. But again, it's not at the same, they're not being offered the same quality of education or access to education and healthcare as urbanites. And in that case, the urban registration becomes sort of meaningless. So I think for all those issues, it's very common for migrants to actually, not want to give up their rural registration. The other thing we've seen starting in 2017 is massive city-initiated evictions of migrants. It started in Beijing after there was a fire in a migrant worker district, and it spread to cities across the country. And I think we've also seen with COVID, not a very welcoming attitude in urban cities in China towards migrant workers coming back. So I do think, again, I don't think that one should read migrant workers deciding that they want to keep rural household registration as a sign of vibrancy or particularly positive sign in terms of their lot or economic development in China.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, most migrant workers are not going to go back to their village and work there. They're gonna, in particular, the new generation of migrant workers or children of migrant workers who were born in cities or in urban areas, they will fight for getting a urban hukou. So maybe they won't get it in Beijing or Shanghai. It's getting harder and harder. Actually, there's been reports indicating that Beijing's population has decreased because of the restrictions you've just mentioned. But they may end up moving to smaller cities. Have you seen that in your book? When you were preparing your book, migrant workers accepting to settling down in smaller cities and municipalities?
It's definitely happening, and it's exactly what the government wants to see happen. They have a very, as is so often the case with policymaking, they have a very top-down vision of how it should be implemented. And we've seen so far in household registration reform, first of all, it's been very piecemeal. It hasn't been, it's certainly not a national effort. And as you say, certain cities have been opened up selectively because either the provincial government or the central government has decided that those cities could use more people. What is often not considered is whether that's where the jobs are. That's where the migrants actually want to go. You even see a situation, and this is actually very common in China, where a government in a city that's not doing very well and perhaps has an excess housing stock, if there's a ghost city there or something, will say, actually, we need more people. Our economy's doing poorly. We have vacant apartments. Let's bring some more migrants in. But where those migrants are going to find jobs, where they're possibly going to find money to buy these vacant apartments is often not considered. Where the jobs are and where migrants would like to go, I would say in most cases they are actually putting up increasing barriers to migrant workers, even in many of the provincial capitals. The other thing that they do, of course, is they have a very complicated point system, which is presented to migrants. And basically, if you earn enough points, then you have a shot at getting an urban hukou. The points are based on a whole bunch of things that are often out of the reach of your average migrant worker. Certain level of education gives you extra points. Most of these migrants, in many cases, they've dropped out of high school. Paying into the social welfare fund is very important. Paying local taxes. In many cases, as I just said, the migrants aren't doing that. So there's all these different things that they have these points-based systems. Shenzhen has bragged about its point-based system to allow migrants to settle there. In my conversations with migrants in Shenzhen, they found it laughable, the idea that they could actually meet these extremely high requirements and have a shot at becoming urbanites with proper urban hukou. They didn't buy it.
There's a question related to that, asking that, from Lindsay Ruza, saying that there's a fair number of migrant workers which hope to start their own company. So how difficult is this, and are there any particular obstacle they face? And I would add to that question, if they start a company and they are successful, is it easier for them to become, to change status and become an urban dweller altogether?
To your last question, I would say no. I mean, if you start a small business in a city like Beijing, you're going to get shut down and run out. Typically, I mean, that's been the story of the last 5 years. We saw this in some cases in a dramatic fashion, like the bricking up of Beijing, where they literally went and bricked off all the doors and the windows of the small shops that were typically run by migrants. There's this whole push to get what Beijing called non-essential businesses out of the city. And the result is thousands of small migrant businesses were shut down and migrant workers were driven out of the city. And as you just mentioned, the population has been reduced. And by the way, this is not just Beijing. Shanghai similarly has set targets to reduce the population. The last thing they want to do is welcome more migrants in. So I don't think it really is potentially in some of these smaller cities or townships, I could see, if you were, there would be the possibility to get a new hukou if you started a business there. If you go back to the countryside, as I did for my book, and particularly to Guizhou, there's actually an effort by local authorities to try to help them become local entrepreneurs back in the countryside. So they've set up, for example, small and medium-sized entrepreneur economic zones. So a new version of the economic zone. And they would, if you came back as a migrant worker, or if you're a local and you start a small business there, you could get tax breaks and so on. So there is this hope that you come back and start a small business. I do think it's very difficult. I mean, I heard many a story from migrant workers. When I asked them about this, about the struggles of trying to, after many years, not usually in the city, but typically going back to the countryside or back to their home province and trying to start a business. And I heard all these stories about things going wrong. They don't necessarily, I remember one migrant I spoke to in Shenzhen who laughed when I brought this idea up, and he talked about his parents who had decided that they were going to go big time into pig raising. And he said they didn't have an idea what they were doing, and they ended up bankrupting their household by not having a market to sell their pigs. So that's just one example. But you're seeing right now, for example, in Guizhou, this encouragement for people to come back. Often they're being encouraged to go into tourism. Guizhou's decided, because of its pristine environment and beauty, that it should be a major, even larger, more important tourist destination. But what you see as you go from village to village is every village is trying to create its own little bed and breakfast, including Binghua. And Binghua, I hope, wins the competition because it's such a beautiful place and there are wonderful people there. But every village, as you drive down the road, is doing the same thing. And, the urbanites have a lot of choices. I think the pandemic probably helped potentially with domestic tourism, but your average urbanite is not just looking at going to Guizhou or Hainan. They're also thinking of going to Paris or Seattle or somewhere else. So I think there's the risk that there'll be a glut of businesses back in the countryside as migrants go back.
Okay, thank you. There's still a lot of questions, so I would like, if you can have maybe shorter answers so we can accommodate more questions. There is one, general question about but you've kind of hinted that it won't be the case, the the elimination of the hukou system. So what is your view on that? How do you think it will be kept in the long run, or this hukou system is going to be eventually abolished?
It depends on what we mean by eventually. I think I don't expect it to happen anytime soon is my short answer. I mean, they've been talking about it since at least 2013 at the third plenum, they announced major reforms, and key ones were dealing with the dual land system and reforming the household registration system. And there's been piecemeal programs in cities around the country. In many cities, they've gone backwards in terms of welcoming migrants into the cities. And so I don't expect it. There's a bunch of reasons why it is very challenging for them to do that. And also, I mean, I just quickly highlight one, there's a lot of resistance from urbanites who have no desire to share their schools or their clinics with migrant families.
Yep. There's a more political question from Brian Mercurio, who asking whether, village people, since China has acceded to WTO, have, people in the village have been more inclined to ask for more democracy, more freedoms and economic opportunities. Have their views shifted? Since you've seen, for instance, the village of Pinghua for a long time, so you've seen the mindset of the people there changing and becoming more aware of their political rights, or asking for more political rights.
Well, I think, and I make this point in the book, I think one of the great misconceptions that many of us had, including myself and other journalists, was that that naturally with economic progress and rising living standards, we would see a commensurate rise in demands for civil rights and political rights. And of course, this was how economic opening to China was sold to the world, certainly by people like former President Bill Clinton when he gave China most favored nation trading status, and then decided to try to bring them into the World Trade Organization. There was this idea that political reform would follow. I don't think we've seen that at all in the cities. If anything, I think the short answer is I think there's been this bargain between the party and the people, which says, we guarantee rising living standards inevitably forever, and as long as they're going up, you don't demand civil rights, you don't demand that much more accountability. We've seen under Xi Jinping a massive, as you well know, a massive step backward in terms of freedom of civil society. And I write about in my book, and I watched in real time the crushing of a labor movement, which was, from one perspective, was helping the party by mediating between, mistreated migrant workers and managers, but it was seen as a threat, and so it was utterly destroyed. So we've seen, steps backward there. I would just say one thing. I do think in a place like Pinghua and the migrants I got to know, I do see a rising consciousness of how the system discriminates against them, and this awareness of what the hukou is and why they're getting, they have the short end of it. So I do think there is a growing awareness of that. And there are surveys that show that that measure levels of satisfaction, and you see high levels of satisfaction in general amongst urbanites. You see, not as high, but not the lowest levels of satisfaction amongst rural people that are in the farmers, people in the countryside. You see the highest levels of dissatisfaction amongst migrant workers, and that's because they actually see how the other half lives, and they don't particularly, it's not something they would welcome.
Thank you. There's another question from Rob Gibson regarding the major theme of your book. I'm going to read it. Other than inefficient labor mobility and property rights, what other factors back up the thesis of your book and lead to the myth of Chinese capitalism? Do you think greater market efficiency is the best choice for China?
So, I talk about different myths in my book, and one of the myths is this. Not too many years ago, it seemed like almost all of us were certain that China was inexorably going to continue to open its economy more and more, thus unleashing more productivity and keep growing. And I think I argue that we've seen over the last number of years, and particularly under the present leadership, a step away from that. And whether you look at the role of private enterprise in China, whether you look at attitudes towards foreign investment, whether you look at hukou reform, I think there's been a step in the backwards. So I think a myth is that this economic reform would continue inexorably. It's one of the myths I deal with. Another one is this idea that companies and countries around the world have been very bought into, which is that China's middle class will just keep growing forever. And I don't think that's happening anymore. We saw this, tremendous surge in the growth of the middle class, and I think we're starting to see that slow down markedly. And I don't see how they can continue to bring people into the middle class and make them, normal parts of the consuming public of China if they continue to have these policies, these legacy policies, holding back, some 1/2 of the population.
There's a related question from Peter Biddy, asking, does the book's title come from an argument that since China doesn't have free markets in land and labor, two of Polanyi's fictional commodities, its form of capitalism is a myth, not really capitalism? Is it related to that kind of?
So, my myth is more this idea. So for me, first of all, it was seen as a catchy title, but for me, capitalism is sort of shorthand for continued economic reform, and I don't think that it's continuing the way that it was for the first 15 years I lived in China, and I think that has huge implications for China's economic development going forward. We saw a series of extremely important reforms that unleashed this tremendous productivity throughout the Chinese economy. Starting obviously with Deng Xiaoping, the dismantling of the communes, the household responsibility system, the rise of the township and village enterprises. We saw a huge surge in rural incomes and in urban incomes as well in the first decade in the 80s. And then later with China's entry to the World Trade Organization and the welcoming in of foreign investment, we also saw an enormous productivity surge unleashed. We saw it earlier, in the late 90s, early 2000s, with the big policies under Zhu Rongji to reform the state enterprises. So all these things sort of unleashed waves of productivity, which drove this economic growth. I don't see that happening right now. I do think if they were to, and it's complicated, but if they were to disband the household registration system and allow people to really live and settle and work where they want to, and if they were to try to bring together the land system so that people in the countryside have more ability to profit from the land, I do think they could unleash new waves of productivity and drive China's growth for many years to come. But I don't see positive signs that that's happening.
Can we move to inequalities and the social and political consequences? That's my own question. You referred to Thomas Piketty, who has been very vocal in criticizing the degree of inequalities in China, and for that reason, his book, Chinese version, has been censored. It hasn't been able to publish his book in China, the latest one, after having been praised by the Chinese leadership for his work. Now, the big question, and here I think observers tend to disagree, is whether growing inequality you've mentioned and you've described, you well analyzed, is a factor of social instability and political instability and political change or not. It seems to be, to date, it hasn't destabilized the political system. It hasn't been a real challenge to the regime. And people are, and that's my own view as well, tend to be more focused in getting justice, getting fairness, than in reducing inequalities. Even the degree of inequality has been increasing in the last 20 years or so. So what is your take on that issue?
So I think there's been great tolerance for inequality, and there's been this almost in the American American idea of the Horatio Alger idea that if you work hard enough, doesn't matter how, you know, humble your beginnings are, that you can make something of yourself. And I do think that often people will, my experience with many people in China is that they don't necessarily care that there are a lot of wealthy people out there, as long as they think they can keep doing better themselves. But I do think that is predicated on an economy that continues to grow at a level where people's living standards keep going up and fairly rapidly. And I, for a lot of reasons, I'm not confident that we are going to see that continuing going forward. So as the economic growth starts to slow or even stagnate, I do think that concerns about inequality come to the fore. As I mentioned earlier, I also do think that there is a growing awareness amongst those people I see as treated as second-class citizens, rural people and migrants, that the system is built such that they they will continue to be second class, no matter how hard they work. There's also an enormous experiment going on right now because we are seeing, as I said earlier, huge numbers of people that have spent their whole lives working in factories no longer having that employment. And we are seeing unprecedented numbers of migrants returning to the countryside with an unclear path, not certain what they're going to do or how they're going to make money. So I think those are all issues. The other thing, as you alluded to, I mean, I think there's always been this idea that you can seek redress, and China's government, central government, has survived forever on this idea that that it's the local governments that are the bad guys, and if you could only make it to Beijing and plead your case to the right person, you know, things will be fixed. And I think that's still a lot of people do believe that. But if as that starts to become, people start to believe that less, if they start to think that the entire system has problems that are to their that are an obstacle to their future economic well-being, then I think it starts to become a problem. Mm-hmm. So I'm not. I'll stop there. I'm not sure that's an answer.
Okay. Now you mentioned, I mean, in your presentation, what are the expectations of the village chief, which was to attract investments and in order to build up a fruit processing factory. What would be the conditions to be met to allow such, or to you know, incentivize such investments?
Well, if you listen to the officials in Beijing, it's all going to be driven by e-commerce. And you listen to Alibaba and Jingdong and so on, they'll say the same thing. And so there's this idea that rural e-commerce is going to, reinvigorate or create new markets across rural China. And I think it's happened to a degree. By the way, anytime you go and talk to a local rural government and ask them how they're going to combat poverty or lift their economic development, they'll immediately start talking to you all about e-commerce. My experience on one of my last trips writing about rural e-commerce, I was with Alibaba actually, was that at that point, rural e-commerce was very clearly benefiting the lives of rural people by giving them access to products that they didn't necessarily have access to before. But in the minds of the officials and the big companies, the more important part of that is taking the products from rural China and selling them out, so that your urbanite with money who wants to buy organic mushrooms or something in the countryside or tea gets access to it. And I think that is starting to happen, but it's happening much more slowly. So anyway, so I think that continues to be an obstacle for rural development. I think it can help, certainly. As I said earlier, for Binghua Cun and for much of Guizhou, the focus is on tourism. And I think that it certainly can work. You can, someone sitting in their little apartment in a high rise in Beijing can look at beautiful pictures of rural Guizhou and decide to go there on their next holiday. And they can get the word out about it, obviously through the internet. So anyway, yeah, I think progress is being made. I do think by the way, there's just one other note. The former head of the World Bank was a huge fan of rural e-commerce in China and about how its role in poverty alleviation and the idea that it could be a model for other countries around the world. I do think it can have a role in that, but I think it was being it was not living up to the sort of the hyped expectations of a lot of people when I was looking at it a few years ago.
We're approaching the end of this presentation. If you have any burning question, you can raise your hand or write a short question in a chat box. I have a final question. You've mentioned migration from the countryside, but another type of migration has occurred, particularly in the last 20 years. You've seen a lot of people from Dongbei, from northeast China, ex-Manchuria, moving out of those three provinces, all the way from Heilongjiang, Jilin to Liaoning. And it seems to be very hard to move them back, and including not only rural people, but people from the urban areas. So, and they, because of a lack of attractiveness of the whole region, and it's a real issue here. Have you looked at this issue in your book, and do you have any comment on that? Because that's really a typical case of regional migration, away from some parts of China.
Yeah, I look at it a bit in my book, although it's not as much of a focus as Southwest. But I do talk about reporting I did there when there were some of the first big labor protests. I went to Liaoyang, and there were big protests around state enterprise that was being shut down then. And there were similarly large protests, of course, up in Daqing, in the oil base. I think that was in 2003. And then I did later, not actually in my book, but later I did reporting and stories for Business Week on the policy of revitalizing the Northeast, as they called it, which was a policy, of course, to try to revitalize it. I do think it's terribly difficult, I think, for historical reasons mainly. I mean, obviously it's going back many years, certainly to the Japanese occupation. It's been a site of heavy industry. The state enterprise culture and economy was more entrenched there than anywhere else. Obviously, it's also heavily reliant on commodities and things like steel production and other things, other commodities, and that too is susceptible to cyclical changes in the economy and indeed what's happening globally. So I don't know. I think it's very difficult. The other thing, the initial waves of layoffs there, many of the people were not very young, obviously. So we had a lot of women were laid off, middle-aged women, and people that had been part of that state enterprise culture their whole life, and I don't think it very particularly easy for those people to reinvent themselves. So anyway, I don't see an easy model to. I suppose if North Korea, the regime changes and there's a economic transformation and a booming economy that could help the northeast of China, but I don't see that happening either. I'm joking.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, the fact that these are landlocked provinces doesn't help, clearly. There's a final short question from someone I'm sure you know, Hu Huiying, asking you about the date of the publication of the Chinese version of your book. Do you have any idea when your book in Chinese is going to be published?
So I don't actually have a date, but it's going to be definitely April. So before the end of April, it'll come out. And I will be, I flashed on the screen at the end of the talk my personal website I have, which is just www.dexterroberts.com, my name. And I will certainly be highlighting the the release of the book when it comes out there. So so anyway, yeah, it'll be in April. I'm
Very
just
good.
now dealing with things like covers and Chinese titles and so on. So yeah, it'll be soon.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. I think we've reached the end of this presentation. Would you like to any final thought, any word of conclusion you would like to give us before
the only thing I would say is, I just mentioned briefly earlier, is I do think that you know, in the sense that I'm hopeful, I do think it's clear that sort of, I think China's future economic development hinges on better treatment of migrant workers and rural people in order to bring them into the middle class. And I think there is a realization amongst many Chinese officials that they need to do that. They need to do away with some of these legacy policies that keep them as in the second class status. So I just say there is a path forward. I think, as I said earlier, I think reform of these policies would do a lot in starting to reverse the wealth gap, and also guarantee China years more of productivity and growth. So that's what I hope. That's what I hope happens.
All right. I think on that note, I would like to thank you very much for this terrific presentation and exchange of views on your latest book. I remind everyone the title of your book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, the Worker, the Factory, and the Future of the World. Thanks a lot, Tiff, for coming to Hong Kong virtually and sharing your views on your latest book. I hope we have maybe an occasion in the future to invite you in person here on
I certainly hope so.
On next trip to Hong Kong. Thanks a
Okay,
lot.
well, thank you very
Thanks
much.
everyone for taking part in this presentation, in this talk, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
All the best in Montana. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.